Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Scully, contributing editor at The Hill, and thank you for joining us for what is our third and final day of A More Perfect Union. It is, of course, a multi-day festival. We have been exploring, and yes, we've been celebrating America's best big ideas through the lens of American reinvention. As you know, throughout our virtual summit, we've been bringing together political leaders, entrepreneurs, policy innovators, and disruptors with a simple goal to discuss some of the most urgent issues of our time. And today's program is all about building consensus, what it means to be in the middle of a country that is seemingly growing more partisan and much more divided. It is, of course, a timely topic with the news overnight. Senator Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, her announcement she is switching from Democrat to her affiliation as an independent. Now, a recent Pew analysis found that, on average, Democrats and Republicans are farther apart ideologically today than really at any time in the past 50 years. And so these questions: does extreme polarization intensify zero-sum competition between Republicans and Democrats in Congress? Post-midterms, what is the status of America's political middle? What is required to engage in civil discussion in today's often harsh political climate? And what about voters who increasingly do not see themselves represented by political extremes on both sides of the aisle? So with all of this, we'll be discussing these topics and much more today. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Altria, for its support of this program. And as a reminder, we've been bringing you multiple sessions throughout the week on a number of topics. You can watch them all, or you can tune into specific segments. Go to our website at thehill.com/events for all of the details. And a quick housekeeping note: before we get underway, you can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag TheHillAMPU. And of course, if you experience any trouble with the live stream, please refresh the page. That should be a pretty quick fix. Joining us from his home in central Pennsylvania is former Republican Congressman David Jolly, now an MSNBC contributor. Congressman, thank you for being part of this conversation. I want to begin with a series of recent Gallup polls that have shown more and more Americans are disillusioned with the Democrats and the Republicans. They identify themselves as independent or third party, and yet third parties have a very difficult time making any sort of breakthrough in our politics. Why?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And to your point, nearly 40% of the country says, I can't see myself in any of the major or minor parties right now. I'm going to declare myself an independent, no party affiliation. But why do we not see the emergence of a viable third party? And there are a few reasons. First, the infrastructure of how we electioneer in the United States has been created by the two major parties. And honestly, they put barriers to entry in place for minor parties to emerge. Every state is different. You actually have to create 50 different state parties and then aggregate them nationally, and all 50 states have different laws. Secondly, we often conflate building a minor party with a run for the presidency. And those two actually can't really coexist in almost the first decade. If you were to start a minor party today, you're not eligible in 50 states to run a presidential candidate under 50 different state laws for probably 5 to 10 years at least. So sometimes we conflate the success of an independent candidate with the bricks and mortar of building a party. But the third point, the last point I'd share with you, Steve, is I think the minor party movement, the independent movement, often gets something wrong. And that is they repeat the fail point of the major parties. That is, they say to join our party, you must agree to these things. And that puts a ceiling in place, right? You've automatically eliminated part of your market. The truth is most of the country and most of the 40% that represent the independent space, their politics are all over the place, left, right, and middle. And so to suggest that somehow you must be centrist, you're eliminating most of that coalition. The answer seems to be in the independent space to create a big enough tent to let all voters see themselves in that. And I would suggest there's lessons in that for the major parties as well. Create a big enough tent to invite more people in.
So there are two follow-ups that I want to take aim at. First of all, do you see any changes in the next perhaps 15 to 20 years in which a third party could rise in American politics?
I do think in states where we are seeing electoral reform, you know, in Alaska where you see open primaries and you see ranked choice voting, you're seeing that in other states as well. electoral reform and the independent movement, the minor party movement, are kind of the closest brethren in the reform space. So we are seeing progress in both, in electoral reform and in the investment in minor parties. The catalyst could actually be a national candidate, right? And as I mentioned, a national candidate's not tied directly to a minor party, but if you had a national candidate that captured hearts and minds, it really injects acceleration into a minor party movement, should that candidate ultimately align with a minor party.
You used a word that I want to follow up on the second point, and that is centrist or compromise, which has really become a bad word in American politics. And as you know, in your former party, as a former Republican, if you compromise, look at people like Representatives Marjorie Taylor Greene or Matt Gaetz, who refer to those as rhinos. Why is it so hard to have that in our politics today? Is it because the primary challenges have essentially become a bigger threat than the general election?
Yeah, structurally, our incentives are all upside down, right? The incentive for an elected official is to operate within your most partisan environment because you're protected in a closed primary where only your most partisan voters show up. You're likely in a gerrymandered district where the general election is never competitive. So if you do what I did and while I was in Congress and step out and compromise or take more moderate positions, you get challenged in a primary and your base doesn't show up in the general. So tone is important because in all walks of life, you do the things that let you keep your job and get ahead. Politicians are no different. They're responding to the incentive structure, which is where if we were to have some radical electoral reform, like in Alaska, you might see voters elect a statewide Republican in Lisa Murkowski and a statewide Democrat in their new House member and do so on the same ballot. That's structural. I would say we can't overlook, call it the moral judgment of our elected officials. Are they doing the right thing by simply responding to the incentive and structure in front of them? Or should they step out of that incentive structure and make decisions that perhaps challenge their party's dogma, but do represent where the heartbeat of the country really is?
Well, you mentioned Alaska, and clearly its newly reelected Republican senator would not have been elected had it not been for ranked choice voting. And now for the first time in 2 generations, a Democrat now has a full 2-year term in Alaska, again, because of ranked choice voting. Should we see more of that in this country?
We absolutely should. Look, it gives everybody a voice, regardless of your party affiliation, and it forces candidates to respond to broader coalitions. You know, the United States is an outlier in really only having 2 major parties. Every other Western democracy pretty much has multi-party democracies. And what it creates is a coalition approach to governing, but it also gives incentives to elected officials to bring more people in. And so, again, the real testament to that, Steve, is that in Alaska, Lisa Murkowski won as a Republican, but you have a Democratic House member. And ultimately, that only happened because Alaska pursued one of the most aggressive electoral reform measures in the country a few years back. That is a wide open primary where all voters and all candidates appear on the ballot. The top 4 moved to November, and they used ranked choice voting to ensure consensus around whoever ultimately emerges as their representative.
If you could put on your MSNBC contributor hat, whether you use the term polarized, fractured, partisan, there is no question that the media today is more coarse and more harsh, that is really creating, many would call, our politics turning toxic. And my question is, how do we get away from this, or is the genie out of the bottle?
I hope the genie's not out of the bottle, but we know we're more tribal and polarized than ever. For generations, our culture kind of defined our politics, and our culture was one in which we all shared a common narrative of American advancement and community. We have shifted that paradigm in the last decade or two to where our politics now drives our culture, and our politics are one of division. They are rewarded, as we mentioned, electorally, but they are also rewarded through both social media platforms and mass media platforms. And the one thing I would point out about where our media is today is we often conflate news with programming. Depending on the platform you subscribe to, try to assess how much news am I getting and how much programming am I getting. And neither is right nor wrong, right? Opinion programming has value. Finding places of common mind are valuable, but we shouldn't conflate that with news. The truth is there are many platforms that provide just hard news, if you will. But sometimes they don't actually win at the ratings war. And then that comes back to a question on us. Are we giving our culture and our society a fair shake to keep the stickiness within our community that actually holds us together?
You have served in Congress, and so you understand the process. Some call it sausage making. Is it as bad here in Washington as it is often portrayed, whether on Fox or MSNBC or CNN or social media? Or is there a sense of bipartisanship among a majority of Congress, Democrats and Republicans?
It's worse. I mean that as a student of the institution. I worked on the Hill for 20 to 30 years, all in. Most of my career has been tied to it as a staffer, a member, a lobbyist, a political consultant. And what I will tell you is the parties themselves crush independent thought, right? So when I served in 14, 15, 16, a Republican who supported marriage equality, gun control, campaign finance control, immigration reform, I wasn't allowed to do that. The parties would not let me exercise those politics. So first, the parties crush the independent thought. Secondly, there is no working across the aisle, zero. And now the way the system is set up, if a leader does reach across the aisle, as we saw with Boehner and perhaps McCarthy may have to do now, there's punishment within their own ranks for doing so. I had a moment during the 2015 leadership election. Boehner had resigned and members were asking for the vote to become whip and leader and speaker. And I asked them a simple question. Tell me when we're going to pass immigration reform and I'll give you my vote. And I was told, do you realize what the American people would do to us if we passed immigration reform? Meaning, don't you dare talk about actually legislating. We're here to do the politics, not the legislating. Obviously, I withheld my vote and it led to the chaos in the 15 speakership election. And we might see that again on January 3rd in today's GOP.
So bottom line, we talked about a couple of fixes. Do you see any practical, realistic short-term solutions?
Well, I do think truly we are seeing real points on the board in electoral reform and in the minor party movement. And in the short run, that's the key. I do think it's inevitable, given that our politics are now a rich man's game, if you will, that we will continue to see flirtations from a national candidate that can self-finance, whether it's a Bloomberg, a Mark Cuban, somebody like that. Does that fix things? No. Does it disrupt it enough to kind of reset how we align? Probably so. Here's the carrot I would offer to either party, and in some ways I offer it to the Democratic Party today because it seems they're more likely to grab it. You could expand your coalition by 5 or 10 points and create a governing coalition for the next 30 years. Simply by inviting in much of those independents who today feel disaffected. The Joe Biden coalition is Democrats, disaffected Republicans, and independents who, from election to election, move left or right. Grab them, invite them in, make them part of your coalition with deliberation, and you'll create a governing coalition that represents the consensus of America.
David Jolly is an MSNBC contributor, a former member of Congress, and a Christmas tree decorator extraordinaire, joining us from his home in Pennsylvania.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Thank you.